And let's talk more about Ukraine now with retired General Tom Lawson, who served as Canada's Chief of Defence Staff from 2012 to 2015. General Lawson, good to have you back on Primetime Politics.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me here.
So we had the Prime Minister making this stealth visit to Kyiv over the weekend, promising more financial support, more missiles, more fighter pilot training, and the extension of Operation Unifier to 2026. I want to get your thoughts on what you made of Justin Trudeau in Ukraine this past weekend.
Right. Well, I think the most important thing about the Prime Minister expressing Canadian support, his support and Canadian support for Ukraine, is the fact that he did it in person for the second time in a year as well. I think what he's doing is he's showing, first and foremost, that there is no weakening of the resolve from Canada and hopefully on behalf of Western allies as well, for supporting Ukraine in this war. And as I say, the fact that he did that in person and came with promises of increased Canadian support is very important and highly appreciated by Ukraine.
Now, there's certainly been a lot of recent talk about Canada's military capacity in terms of personnel, in terms of equipment. You've talked to us before, actually, about the Canadian military needing to be very careful in prioritizing its resources. So we know we've had now another batch of announcements on what Canada is going to be contributing. Are we at risk of approaching the limit of what the Canadian Armed Forces can send Ukraine?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was very careful to make it clear that most of what is being brought to Ukraine by Canada now is financial aid. $2.5 billion towards reconstruction, $500 million more in terms of military gear, some fighter pilot training, which certainly Canada would be able to supply. But in terms, to your point, in terms of increased feet on the ground to support Ukrainian training, not a lot of specifics there. So I don't think he's putting at risk the missions that are underway that are now supported by Canadian troops in Latvia and various other parts around the world. Largely, this is showing that Canada is coming to the table with other Western allies and providing them support from a military equipment point of view and from a financial point of view.
Okay, let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine right now as we speak. When President Volodymyr Zelensky was with the Prime Minister on Saturday, he said counter-offensive defensive actions were taking place, not offering a lot of specifics, but we are getting some reports and some images that are suggesting some small gains in southeastern Ukraine in terms of clearing Russian control of some villages. So I want to get your initial reaction to the start of this pushback on what is a 1,000-kilometer front line.
Right. So there are a few things that we can know about offensives, counteroffensives, and in particular this counteroffensive. One is that it's a proven military strategy that when you're on the offensive, you should conceal your intentions. So this remarkable openness that we've seen from Ukrainian military and political leaders over the last year, as they've been largely on the defensive or pushing back Russian offensives, is now starting to shut down because the shoe's on the other foot. And offensives are a very difficult thing to carry out. It's tougher to be on the offensive than the defensive. So largely, we're going to see Ukraine wanting to be very, very deceptive regarding if and when the offensive is underway and which towns will be hit. So that doesn't relieve Western media of the need to report what they can find. So we saw that 16 American armored vehicles were taken out, probably accurately so by the Russians in one of the portions of the counteroffensive. But I think it'll be weeks, if not months, before we really have an idea of what's going on with the offensive. One thing we do know about it is it's critical for Ukraine to show some amount of progress and success in their offensive in order to bolster the confidence of Western allies and bolster their patience and support, which likely won't be a problem in Canada, where 3% of Canadians claim a Ukrainian heritage as their background, but other NATO allies may be a little weaker in that, and they'll be looking for success on the battlefield. So this is a critical, perhaps a turning point for Ukrainian forces.
And I did want to ask you what the challenges are for Ukraine in pushing back against Russia's occupation. Obviously, there is the difference just in the size between Russia and Ukraine, but we are dealing with that dam collapse, the Kakhovka Dam. Canada promising humanitarian aid for this. A lot of disruption, flooding, evacuations, right in the middle of this war. So can you talk a bit about the Ukrainian military and what they're going to be facing now over these next weeks and months as this counteroffensive is getting underway?
Right. First to the dam, there's a few things we can know, and we do know about the dam at Nova Kakhovka. It's a USSR era dam, mid-50s, 100-foot high waterhead that stretches back 250 kilometers. So a lot of water held by this very important power dam, and it's been in Russian hands for a year and a half. What we don't know absolutely clearly, and all politicians are being a little careful, is what has caused its demise. There is some likelihood the Russians blew it with their own explosives to create a humanitarian situation, regardless of the disaster downstream. Russians have shown they don't care too much about that, and to create a diversion that Ukrainian forces and people would have to deal with. So that's a possibility. There's another possibility, and that is that since it's been in Russian hands, it hasn't been up to the same levels of maintenance that were required, and maybe it gave way under some of the damages caused over the last year and a half of conflict. Both of those absolutely fall within the responsibility of Russians. A third possibility, of course, is that this is a false flag operation by Ukrainians. However, that's very hard to support. Hard to believe that Ukrainian authorities would ever want to create such damage on their own property. So it's likely one of the first two. Our own Prime Minister and other Western politicians, certainly the head of the European Union, have said this is a Russian responsibility. But it does create a blunting to the attack, a diversion for the Ukrainian forces to be aware of and to deal with. To your point of the problems now being dealt with by the Ukrainian forces, it's just plain easier to be on the defensive. And the Russians have had months and months to set up anti-tank barriers and to get behind them, to dig trenches and make it very difficult for them to be dug out of these defensive positions. Regardless of whatever strategy, however clever it is, the Ukrainians are setting up, it will be a very difficult thing. Now, what they have going for them is they now, for the first time, have combined arm operations training. And what this means is that Ukrainians are bringing all types of warfare together, including support from the air, together with armor, artillery, and boots on the ground to bring to bear against the Russians. The Russians haven't seen this kind of warfare before, and they don't practice it themselves. So Ukraine has a lot going for them, but a huge challenge ahead, and one that has to work out in their favor.
Okay, we'll certainly keep watching. Retired General Tom Lawson, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.